60 seconds. That's how long it took Representative Thomas Massie to completely destroy FBI Director Kash Patel's carefully constructed narrative about the Epstein files. 1 minute of reading from FBI documents that Patel thought would never be mentioned in a public hearing. Documents that name exactly who Jeffrey Epstein trafficked his victims to, not vague allegations from anonymous sources, not conspiracy theories circulating online. Official FBI FD 302 forms. The standardized witness interview reports that federal agents complete after every formal interview. The documents that victims filled out when they cooperated with the 2019 federal investigation in New York. And according to those forms sitting in FBI files right now, at least 20 specific men were named by victims as people Epstein trafficked them to. 20 men with names, identities, and documented connections to the trafficking operation. Massie read one name out loud on the congressional record: Jess Staley, former CEO of Barclays Bank, a man already forced to resign after UK regulators investigated his Epstein connections. A man whose name appears in FBI victim testimony. And the other 19 names. Massie couldn't say them without risking defamation lawsuits. But he could describe them by category: one royal prince, one Hollywood producer worth hundreds of millions, at least 6 billionaires, one magician, one high-profile government official currently or recently in power. What happened in that 60-second exchange exposed something Kash Patel desperately wanted to keep hidden. The FBI has the names. They have the victim testimony. They have official documentation of who participated in Epstein's trafficking network. And they've chosen to do absolutely nothing about it. The House Judiciary Committee. A routine oversight hearing with FBI Director Kash Patel. Standard questions about ongoing investigations, resource allocation, DOJ coordination. The kind of hearing that usually produces soundbites for cable news, but rarely reveals anything substantive. Thomas Massie had other plans. The Kentucky congressman sat with a stack of papers in front of him. Not talking points prepared by staffers. Not political messaging designed for viral clips. Actual documents. FBI records. Victim testimony forms documenting exactly who Epstein trafficked women to. Massie is an MIT-trained engineer who built successful technology companies before entering Congress. He doesn't operate on emotion or political theater. He operates on data, evidence, and logical arguments systematically presented. When he asks a question, it's because he already knows the answer and wants to force it into the congressional record. And today he was going to force Kash Patel to either admit the FBI has names of Epstein's co-conspirators documented in official files, or lie under oath about what his own agency possesses. Director Patel, Massie began, his tone measured but carrying an edge that suggested something important was coming. I watched some of your Senate hearing yesterday. This was the setup, establishing that he'd been paying attention to Patel's testimony in a different venue. Building toward a contradiction. Senator Kennedy asked you, "You've seen most of the files. Who, if anyone, did Epstein traffic these women to besides himself?" The question hung in the air for a moment. A simple, direct question that Kennedy had asked in the Senate. You replied, according to the transcript, "There is no credible information that he trafficked them to anyone else." There it was. Patel's sworn testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee. On the record, under oath, Jeffrey Epstein trafficked victims only to himself. Nobody else was involved. No credible evidence suggests otherwise. Massie was about to prove that was a lie using the FBI's own documents. But first he needed to address Patel's standard excuse for why broader prosecutions haven't happened. You also said somewhere in the hearing and here today that the problem is that the case files are constrained by limited search warrants from 2006 to 2007. And that the non-prosecution agreement hamstrung future investigations. This was Patel's go-to deflection. The 2008 sweetheart deal that gave Epstein 13 months in county jail with work release also granted immunity to potential co-conspirators. That agreement, combined with narrowly written search warrants from the Florida investigation, created legal constraints on what prosecutors could pursue. It's a convenient excuse. Blame the previous investigation's limitations. Suggest that current prosecutors want to do more but are legally prevented. Massie wasn't buying it for a second. Those constraints, he said, his voice sharpening, only apply to Southern District of Florida. Perfect. Precise. Devastating. The 2006 to 2007 investigation was in Florida. The non-prosecution agreement was negotiated by the Southern District of Florida U.S. Attorney's Office. Any legal constraints from that investigation apply only to that jurisdiction. They do not apply to Southern District of New York. And there's the kill shot. Because in 2019, Epstein was arrested and indicted in the Southern District of New York, a completely separate federal jurisdiction, with its own investigation, its own evidence, its own legal authority unconstrained by anything that happened in Florida over a decade earlier. The location of the 2019 sex trafficking indictment, Massie continued, which produced many things including a series of FD 302 documents, FD 302S, FBI Form 302, the official document agents use to record witness interviews. Every formal interview gets documented in an FD 302 summarizing what was said. These are official FBI records, not hearsay, not rumors, documented testimony given to federal investigators. According to victims who cooperated with the FBI in that investigation, Massie said, "These documents in FBI possession, your possession, detail at least 20 men, including Mr. Jess Staley, CEO of Barclays Bank who Jeffrey Epstein trafficked victims to. Jess Staley, CEO of one of the world's largest banks, named in FBI victim testimony as someone Epstein trafficked women to. Staley had already been forced to resign after UK regulators found he'd mischaracterized his Epstein relationship. Email exchanges he claimed were minimal turned out to be extensive. And now Massie was putting on record that victims named Staley in their FBI interviews. Victims including minors, Massie added, such as Virginia Roberts Giuffre. May she rest in peace. Virginia Roberts Giuffre, Epstein's most prominent victim, publicly accused Prince Andrew, fought for years to expose Epstein's co-conspirators, gave extensive FBI testimony about who she was trafficked to. She died in 2023. Her testimony remains documented in FBI FD 302S. That list also includes at least 19 other individuals. Massie continued. And then he began reading the categories, each one more damning than the last, each one revealing how deep Epstein's network penetrated into centers of power and wealth. One Hollywood producer worth a few $100 million, wealthy, powerful within entertainment, named in FBI victim testimony. No investigation launched. One royal prince, Prince Andrew, Virginia Giuffre's most famous accusation, the disastrous BBC interview claiming he couldn't sweat, settled her lawsuit for millions rather than face trial, never faced criminal charges despite multiple women naming him. His name appears in FBI FD 302 victim interviews. One high-profile individual in the music industry, someone famous and powerful in music, named by Epstein's victims to the FBI. One very prominent banker, separate from Staley, another banker at the highest levels of finance. One high-profile government official, someone currently serving or recently retired, not a minor bureaucrat. Someone important enough to be high profile. That person appears in FBI victim testimony. One high-profile former politician, someone whose political career was significant, participated in Epstein's network according to victims who testified to federal investigators. One owner of a car company in Italy. Specific enough the FBI knows who. Wealthy enough to own automobile manufacturing. One rock star. Famous enough the descriptor alone is sufficient. Named by victims in FBI interviews. One magician, not just an entertainer, a magician, famous enough victims could identify him. His name sits in FBI files. At least 6 billionaires. Massie concluded, including a billionaire from Canada. At least 6, meaning the actual number could be higher. 6 people who have accumulated personal wealth exceeding $1 billion. People with that level of financial resources and the influence that comes with it. People whose names appear in FBI victim testimony documenting how Epstein trafficked women to them. All documented in FD 302S. All sitting in files the FBI has possessed for years. All facing zero investigation despite victims naming them to federal law enforcement. We know these people exist in the FBI files, Massie said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. The files that you control. He looked directly at Patel. I don't know exactly who they are, but the FBI does. This was crucial. Massie was being careful not to name individuals beyond Staley. Doing so without absolute proof would open him to defamation lawsuits. But by describing them categorically based on what's documented in FBI files, he was making clear these aren't vague allegations. These are specific people, with specific identities, known to federal law enforcement, documented in official FBI records. And the FBI has done nothing. Have you launched any investigations into any of these people? Massie asked. The first critical question. And have you seen these 302 documents? The second critical question. Two simple direct questions. Either investigations have been launched or they haven't. Either Patel has reviewed the victim testimony or he hasn't. Patel's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic evasion. Sir, I have asked my FBI agents to review the entirety of the Epstein files and bring forth any credible information. Notice the language carefully. I have asked, not I have reviewed personally. Not I have examined the evidence. Not I have investigated these 20 names. Patel was creating distance between himself and direct knowledge of what's in the files, building plausible deniability that would allow him to claim later he didn't know specific details. And we're working with Congress not only to divulge that information and produce it to you, but any investigations that arise from any credible investigation will be brought. More evasion. Working with Congress suggests cooperation. Any credible investigation leaves room to dismiss victim testimony as not credible. The language commits to absolutely nothing concrete. Then came the key sentence. There have been no new materials brought to me launching a new indictment. Translation. The FBI hasn't brought Patel evidence sufficient to justify new charges, which means either that evidence doesn't exist in FBI files, or it exists but isn't being brought to the director's attention. Given what Massie just described, 20 names documented in FD 302 victim interviews, the second option seems far more likely. Massie immediately spotted the loophole Patel was trying to exploit. So is the loophole here, or is it your assertion that these victims aren't credible? That the 302s maybe didn't produce credible statements that rise to probable cause? Perfect prosecutorial questioning. Force Patel to choose. Either the victims are lying, in which case why did the FBI bother documenting their testimony? Or the victims are telling the truth, and the FBI is ignoring credible evidence. Pick one. Patel tried to spread the blame. It's not my assertion, sir. It's the assertion of two different United States attorneys' offices from three separate administrations who investigated those same materials in their lifetime. Three administrations. Obama, Trump, Biden. All reviewed the evidence. All declined to prosecute. Patel was suggesting this isn't partisan. Multiple administrations across both parties looked at this and reached the same conclusion. But that explanation raises more questions than it answers. Why did prosecutors under three different presidents all decide not to pursue cases despite victim testimony naming specific individuals? Massie pressed forward. Are the 302 documents in the FBI's possession? They reviewed all that. Yes, sir. Confirmation. The FBI has the FD 302 victim interview forms. And so have you reviewed those 302 documents where the victims name the people who victimized them? I personally. I don't know, but the FBI has more distancing. Patel wouldn't confirm he'd personally reviewed the documents, maintaining plausible deniability about what he knows regarding specific names in victim testimony. Massie went for the throat. So how can you sit here and in front of the Senate and say there are no names? There it is. The fundamental contradiction. Patel testified to the Senate that there's no credible information about Epstein trafficking to anyone else. But the FBI has FD 302s naming at least 20 specific men that victims said they were trafficked to. Both statements cannot be true. Patel tried to deflect again. I said, we are not in the practice at the Department of Justice and FBI of releasing victims' names. That is not what we do. Completely missing the point. Nobody asked about releasing victim names publicly. The question is whether the FBI is investigating the perpetrators those victims named. We are also not in the habit of releasing incredible information. That's not what we do. Incredible meaning not credible, suggesting the victim testimony doesn't meet standards for reliability. But if that's true, why document it in official FD 302 forms at all? Why conduct extensive interviews with victims if their statements aren't going to be taken seriously? But multiple authorities have looked at the entirety of what we have, Patel concluded weakly, and chosen to do nothing. That's the part he didn't say. Multiple prosecutors, multiple administrations, multiple reviews of the same evidence, all reaching the same conclusion: no charges. In 60 seconds, Massie forced into the congressional record that FBI victim interviews document at least 20 men as participants in Epstein's trafficking network. He named Staley publicly. He described 19 others: royalty, billionaires, government officials, corporate executives, entertainers. And he exposed that despite this documented testimony sitting in FBI files for years, Kash Patel and the FBI have launched zero investigations. Either the FBI doesn't believe trafficking victims when they name abusers, making victim cooperation meaningless, or the FBI does believe them, has documented testimony in official records, knows the names of 20 men who participated, and has deliberately chosen not to investigate because those men are too wealthy, too powerful, too connected. Both options represent complete justice system failure, but only one explains why FD 302's documenting specific names would be filed away and ignored for years. Massie gave the FBI a choice: investigate the 20 men named in victim testimony, or admit American law enforcement exists to protect the powerful, rather than prosecute them. Patel's response: bureaucratic evasion, blame spreading, refusal to confirm he's reviewed victim testimony, makes clear which option the FBI chose. Subscribe because what Massie just forced into the congressional record changes the entire Epstein conversation. It's no longer about what might be in classified files, it's about what is documented in FBI FD 302's that nobody is acting on. Share this everywhere because Americans deserve to know their FBI has 20 names, has victim testimony, has official documentation, and has chosen to do nothing. Thanks for watching.